Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're listening from. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the ITTC for this opportunity and to all the participants for their attendance. I have been invited here to share my views on the negotiations on fisheries subsidies in my capacity as chair of the negotiating group on rules. In today's presentation, I will focus on the following points. First, how did we get here? I will share my understanding of the history of the fisheries subsidies negotiations at the WTO, including since I took the role of chair. Second, where are we now? So that's where the process stands at this moment, and highlight what are, in my view, some of the main issues in the negotiations. And third, where do we go now? A few words about the process going forward. So how did we get here? These negotiations were launched 2 decades ago for the reasons that were eloquently put as a confluence of intellectual, institutional, and political factors in the UNEP's publication from 2010. The WTO established a mandate to negotiate fisheries subsidies as part of the Doha round in 2001, with a mandate to clarify and improve existing WTO disciplines on fisheries subsidies. That mandate was elaborated in 2005 at the Hong Kong Ministerial Conference to emphasize disciplines to prohibit fisheries subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. At the Hong Kong Ministerial, the focus of the discussions shifted from arguing around the negotiating mandate to identifying the types of subsidies to be prohibited, those that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity, including special and differential treatment for developing countries. However, despite a lot of work, these negotiations went quiet in mid-2011. Intense negotiations started soon after the 2015 UN General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with target 14.6 stating that the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies should, and I quote, by 2020, prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiation, and a close quote. This mandate was echoed by the decision at the WTO's 11th Ministerial Conference, which relevantly reads that, and I quote, members agree to continue to engage constructively in the fisheries subsidies negotiations with a view to adopting by the Ministerial Conference in 2019 an agreement on comprehensive and effective disciplines, close quote. This decision set a target to complete the negotiations by the following Ministerial Conference, that is MC12, which was to then be held in December 2019, later rescheduled for June 2020, and now scheduled for the end of November this year. This implied calendar deadline was missed, partly because the previous chair had to leave Geneva in July 2019, and it was only in November of that same year that members were able to agree to a new chair, and that's when I took up the role. However, in my reading, the deadline established by WTO ministers still holds, as MC12 is yet to take place, in principle in end November 2021. So following my appointment as chair in November 2019, the negotiations intensified, and in early 2020, it seemed that an agreement in MC12, which then was scheduled for June 2020, was possible. Unfortunately, several factors intervened. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in March 2020, and the restrictions of movement were imposed. That meant the following: no physical meetings were possible. MC12 was indefinitely postponed. In addition, the previous WTO Director General, Roberto Acevedo, announced that he would be leaving, meaning that the DG instance would not be available to support the process. Despite these challenges, our work continued, and we made significant progress. In June 2020, members accepted a draft consolidated document, that is a single document mainly made of facilitators' drafts and member submissions, as a basis for our work going forward. This text has since evolved and is now in its second revision. I know what some of you are already thinking. The negotiations started in 2001, that is 20 years ago. And only now, at the 11th hour, are we seeing contours of the new agreement. So how is that possible? Before turning to the critical issues that continue to divide views today, allow me to first provide my views on the reasons why it has taken so long to get here. And please don't take this as a justification for spending 20 years in negotiating this agreement. I do agree that 20 years is way too long, but instead take this as an insight into why it has taken so long to get here. The way I see it, there are several reasons why these negotiations, which if you're a child would be old enough to drive and to drink in most of your respective jurisdictions, so why these negotiations haven't yet concluded. First, it has taken this long partly because negotiating a multilateral agreement such as this one is not a simple process. The complexity of the issues, ambitious objectives, and the need to reach consensus among a large number of members with competing interests often leads to negotiations spanning decades. Take the law of the sea, for example. Developing an international agreement on the law of the sea began here in Geneva at the first UN Conference on the Law of the Sea back in 1956. And it was only 24 years later, at the end of the third conference in 1982, that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, was signed. Second, WTO is not a fisheries management organization. A plethora of international and regional agreements and rules on fishing and fisheries management already exist, including the Law of the Sea Convention and other instruments such as the UN Fish Stock Agreement, the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, and the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, to name just a few. While these existing instruments fail to address the problem of fisheries subsidies, we have to make sure that our disciplines are coherent with these agreements and regulations dealing with the fisheries. And getting the right fit for our part of the puzzle here is not an easy task. Let me give you some examples why. Definitions. In some cases, we can use other agreements, such as for the definition of IUU fishing. But in some cases, there are no internationally agreed definitions, such as for small-scale or artisanal fishing. At this stage, most delegations agree it will be difficult for the WTO to establish new definitions. So creative ways have to be found to get around using terms with no already agreed definitions. Maritime zones established by the Law of the Sea. A long and complex negotiation process preceded the adoption of the zonal approach to ocean governance, meaning UNCLOS established maritime zones in different areas of the oceans, crafting a careful balance of rights and obligations in each maritime zone for different purposes, including management of fisheries. We have to be careful that any rules agreed here do not disturb that balance. Another example, territoriality. The WTO is not a body that deals with any territorial disputes. Thus, it is important to draft these rules carefully so that they have no legal implications regarding territoriality or the delimitation of maritime jurisdiction. Third, the lack of reliable data. First and foremost, there is a lack of reliable data concerning the level of subsidies that WTO members provide to their fisheries sectors. Related to this is how different sources define the term subsidy for their respective purposes. The WTO has its definition in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, but other organizations such as the OECD or the Sea Around Us project use their own different definitions of a subsidy, making it hard to compare results or reconcile differences. Furthermore, not every member notifies its subsidies to the WTO, and most of those that do notify do not provide data on the total value of their subsidies to fisheries. Similarly, on IUU fishing, our mandate calls for eliminating subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing activities. But we do not know exactly how big the problem is, because of course, illegal fishers do not report their catch, and nobody would admit to subsidizing them. Indeed, I do not think any country deliberately subsidizes IUU fishing. But with no reporting, we simply do not know the real magnitude of the problem. According to the FAO's estimates, however, IUU fishing activities are responsible for the loss of between 11 and 26 million tons of fish each year, with a value of between 10 and 23 billion US dollars. This means that up to 1 out of every 5 fish on the market may be caught illegally. But I think we can agree that even the most conservative estimates indicate that IUU fishing is a big problem. Fourth, in negotiating the rules on fisheries subsidies, we are venturing into uncharted territory for the WTO. The WTO has lots of agreements, but they all deal with trade and trade-related issues. In these negotiations, our objective is different. This is the first time that the WTO negotiations are about sustainability. The existing subsidy rules already address the distortive effects of subsidies on trading goods, including fish products. So what we're doing here is in addition to that, namely to offset negative effects of subsidies on the sustainability of fish stocks. Before, when oceans were healthy, fisheries subsidies were used to enable fishers to catch more fish. Then the idea was to increase catch on the implicit assumption that the resources could sustain ever-increasing levels of catch. Today, however, the consequences of these and other production maximizing fisheries policies are being felt around the globe. 1/3 of fish stocks are overfished, and most of the remainder are fully exploited. This means that providing fisheries subsidies may easily raise or maintain fishing capacity or effort beyond sustainable levels. So at the WTO, we have had to change our mindset a bit. Negotiators at the WTO who have experience with subsidies and their impact on trade now have to weigh up the impact a subsidy will have on fishery sustainability, a new issue for the multilateral trading system. That said, by now we have been grappling with this novelty for many years. Unfortunately, we appear to be getting familiar with it. In this context, a related issue is that the WTO's subsidy rules only cover subsidies that are specific or targeted to particular companies, sectors, or regions. Some participants in the negotiations advocate extending the fisheries subsidies disciplines also to non-specific subsidies, where they flow in part to fisheries. In their view, while specificity is clearly relevant to trade distortion, it may be less so to sustainability, and some of the largest types of fisheries subsidies are non-specific. Therefore, the discussion of how and whether to adjust the new rules to encompass these types of subsidies is difficult and complex. And the fifth and final point I would highlight for why it has taken so long to conclude these negotiations is that the new disciplines, as part of the overall WTO agreements, will be legally binding. So precise terms and definitions are important, and they have to apply across all 164 members. This level of precision naturally takes time to negotiate. So where are we now? Last year, in 2020, despite the pandemic, the negotiating group accomplished a key milestone. That is, accepting a single draft consolidated document as the basis for work ahead. While everyone is now working on this single basis, I do want to be clear that this draft is without prejudice to any member's positions or views on any issue, whether reflected in the draft or not. Broadly speaking, this draft consists of 3 parts. In the first, we have the scope and definitions. The next part contains the 3 core pillars of the disciplines on subsidies to IUU fishing, to fishing on overfished stocks, and contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. This part of the draft also includes pillar-specific draft provisions on special and differential treatment, SNDT. And the third part consists of other cross-cutting elements such as technical assistance and capacity building, notification and transparency, institutional arrangements, dispute settlement, and some final provisions. As the text has evolved since last June, and as I mentioned, we're now in the second revision of the draft text, progress has slowed down. And this is natural, because now that we have progressed on some of the less contentious points, we face difficult decisions on some of the critical points. I will highlight some of those. First, concerning the prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. In many ways, this is at the heart of the negotiations. The current draft text for this issue presents a compromise between 2 different approaches that have been discussed for years without resolution. The approaches are a prohibition based on a list of prohibited subsidies and a prohibition only when subsidies have caused negative effects on fisheries resources. The compromise hybrid approach in the text aims to strike a balance. It contains a list of presumptively prohibited subsidies, modulated by a provision that would permit such subsidies to be provided where measures are in place to maintain fish stocks at a biologically sustainable level. To date, however, while we have had very constructive discussions on the hybrid approach, which have clarified everyone's understanding of what the draft text intends to do, some members remain entrenched in their preferred approaches. In particular, some continue to argue for a pure list approach, where the listed subsidies would never be allowed under any circumstances. They say that the problem is structural overcapacity, and the only way to address this is to prohibit subsidies that could contribute to it. Other members, however, would prefer an approach where subsidies would only be prohibited if insufficient management measures were in place. Reaching agreement on the approach to this pillar of the discipline is urgent if we're serious about fulfilling our mandate. Second, the question of due process requirements for IUU fishing determinations. The basic idea of prohibiting subsidies that go to IUU fishing is that when a vessel or operator of that vessel is found by certain entities to be engaged in IUU fishing, no member would be able to subsidize it. We're still working on finalizing the list of those entities, but when an entity from the list finds that a vessel or operator is engaged in IUU fishing, our draft text refers to this as an IUU fishing determination. What is clear is that most members need some due process to be able to accept an IUU fishing determination as a trigger of the subsidy prohibition. The fundamental issue is drafting the right language. The draft consolidated text first reflected members' concerns by using the language fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory procedures. However, some members were concerned that this language was too prescriptive. The text was then revised to simpler language, only referring to due process. But now some members argue back that this simple language is too vague. So the discussion on this important question has become somewhat circular, and we will need to find a way forward. Third, concerning the dispute settlement mechanism. Members consider that the starting point here is that the existing WTO mechanism for settlement of disputes established in the provisions of Article 22 and 23 of GATT 1994 and elaborated and applied by the DSU would apply to the fisheries subsidies disciplines. This does not resolve, however, the critical issue of the standard of review that would apply. The common denominator among members is that the WTO dispute settlement panels should not second-guess the substance of national authorities' fisheries management policies, decisions, and outcomes, including the substantive merits of individual IUU fishing determinations and stock assessments. Some members go further, seeking an explicit provision that would prevent panels from looking even at the procedural aspect of those policies, decisions, and outcomes. Other members, however, are concerned that completely excluding the possibility of any kind of panel review could render the relevant provisions ineffective. They would prefer to approach the issue more cautiously. The issue here is one of balance, to craft an effective but not overreaching mechanism. Fourth, concerning application of disciplines to small-scale and artisanal fishing. Many members think that categories of fishing roughly described as small-scale or artisanal should be subject only to limited, if any, subsidies disciplines due to the socioeconomic aspects of such fishing. That is, the importance of such fishing activities to livelihood and food security to many coastal communities around the world. However, there is no generally accepted definition in international fisheries instruments of either small-scale or artisanal fishing, and WTO members have had no success in reaching agreement on these terms for purposes of the new disciplines. So any modulation of the disciplines in respect of these categories of fishing would be difficult to achieve based on the use of these terms. An alternative approach suggested by some members is an exemption based on geographic area, whether near shore, however defined, or more distant, and with or without other conditions reflecting that we are focusing on the activities that are conducted not for commercial purposes, but for livelihood and food security. Two issues are impeding progress on this question. The first issue is the placement of any flexibility for subsidies to small-scale or artisanal fishing. Some members consider that this should be treated as an exemption from the scope of the disciplines relating to overfished stocks and overcapacity and overfishing. Some consider that any such exemption, if limited to those pillars, should be treated on a pillar-specific basis, rather than as a question of the overall scope of the disciplines. Some consider that such an exemption should cover all pillars, including subsidies to IUU fishing. That is, that the disciplines will not apply at all to subsidies to this type of fishing. Some say that instead of being treated as a question of the overall scope of the disciplines, any such flexibility should apply to developing and LDC members only, and thus be treated as an SNDT issue. And finally, of course, some members consider that no such exemption is needed. The second issue is whether the treatment of subsidies to these types of fishing should be addressed in whole or in part using a geographic limitation. In particular, some members consider that in principle, any such exemption should apply only within 12 nautical miles of the shoreline, generally the so-called territorial waters. Other members consider that such a geographic limitation would be too narrow, saying that their artisanal fishers fish beyond such an area, with some of these members calling for an exemption for the entire exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. And finally, concerning special and differential treatment. All members recognize that the final form and scope of SNDT can only be determined once the basic disciplines have come clearly into focus. That said, as we have moved forward with drafting the disciplines, the discussions on possible SNDT provisions have proceeded apace. There remain, however, substantive differences over how to incorporate SNDT to the fisheries subsidies disciplines, because some developing WTO members are among the biggest fishing nations in the world and among the biggest subsidizers. Some members think that SNDT should be needs-based and should take the form of transition periods and technical assistance to implement the disciplines. Others say that SNDT should be based on criteria like GNI per capita and share of global marine fish catch. Still, others are seeking certain geographical or other carve-outs from the disciplines. At the core of this issue is finding the right balance between providing necessary flexibility through special and differential treatment while ensuring that this does not undermine the disciplines and thus ultimately the sustainability of fish stocks. So finally, on the process going forward, it is encouraging to see that we all share the sense of urgency to reach a successful outcome, and all members have repeatedly underscored their commitment to be flexible and to engage continuously. We already have held 3 clusters of meetings this year, with a 4th coming next week. We continue to work between the clusters in various configurations and modes, at both technical and heads of delegation levels. As you all know, Dr. Ngozio Konjuwala has recently assumed her role as Director General, and the fisheries subsidies negotiations are high on her priority list. I'm working very closely with her on finding ways to unlock some of the key issues going forward, especially the 5 critical issues mentioned earlier. And do not forget, the world is watching. This is about the health of our oceans. We must deliver. Engagement from other international organizations, civil society, and the public has placed the spotlight on us. We do not want to disappoint. And we're almost there. We have the draft consolidated text, we have the momentum, we have political will to cross the finish line. So now it is time to finish the job, and we need to do it soon. As you all know, the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference is now scheduled for November 2021 in Geneva. But we cannot wait until then to finish our work. As I have been saying since last year, these negotiations are like a debt to the health of the oceans that we, the WTO members, owe to the global community. It is a debt that is now overdue. And as with any other debt, not being able to pay it on time does not mean that the debt is gone. In fact, it is a debt that increases every day that goes by. And we now have a very real opportunity to conclude these long-running negotiations. WTO members need to embrace it and make their utmost efforts to find the flexibility, compromise, and political will to make it a reality. I trust this will happen. Thank you. I'll be very glad to answer any questions at this point, if there are any. So I don't know how we would like to proceed on this matter. Maybe you can raise your virtual hand and we'll give you the floor, or maybe you can just jump in or send it via chat. I don't see any virtual hands or questions in the chat, but again, if anybody wants to jump in, you're free to do so. I'm happy to answer some questions if there are any. Yes, I see a virtual hand raised. I can only see the name Mauritius. Tejaswini, I think. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much to the WTO and to you, Ambassador, for the very enlightening presentation and for giving a lot of information on the negotiations. I have one question with regard to the geographical limitation that you've talked about with regard to the discussion on the 12 nautical miles and the EEZ. While some countries have an argument of their artisanal fishing stops within the 12 nautical miles, other countries are saying that artisanal fishing goes beyond 12 nautical miles, and that is in the EEZ. Can you please give some more information on that as to how negotiations have been going around on that? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for your question. I mean, there's not much in addition to say from what I said earlier, but let me just go back a bit on that topic. The discussion is that discussion of artisanal fishing within the territorial sea or 12 nautical miles or beyond. So that means the EEZ, for instance, is within the broader discussion of how we're going to deal with artisanal fishing or small scale fishing, however we want to define it. Of course, many members have been saying that it would be hard to consider any vessel as artisanal fishing or small scale vessel or small scale fishing if it's able to go beyond the 12 nautical miles. And that has been the discussion for the past, say, days, where we have been discussing this issue with the negotiating group on rules. So that's where we are right now. There hasn't been a lot of progress there because, of course, positions are whether you consider this to be limited to 12 nautical miles or if you need to go this beyond the 12 nautical miles. So that's one of those criteria within the discussion of how to deal with artisanal fishing. But for now, that's really one of the questions pending to be resolved by members. So there's not much to say on that regard, but hopefully I will be able to have something extra to say soon if we manage to overcome that big question we still have in front of us. So thanks again for your question. I hope that solves a bit your doubt.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Would anybody else like to take the floor, ask a question, maybe make a comment? Please just raise your hand and we'll unmute. Yeah, so I see Brian Benjamin, you have the floor.
Ambassador, morning, how are you? To what extent has penalties been looked at in this whole issue? Or non-conformance? Well, non-conformance penalties.
Thank you, Benjamin, for that question. Well, these negotiations have been held in the bigger framework of the WTO, whereas, as you know, they're not. We don't have any, let's say, monetary penalties, at least not as a remedy for non-compliance at the beginning. There's, of course, the countermeasures you may be able to take after the dispute settlement process fulfills all its procedures. But for now, the discussions have been going on the remedy issue under dispute settlement. So that's what would be a member required to do when it's, say, it's after a dispute settlement process, it's confirmed that there's no compliance with the disciplines. The remedy for now that has been discussed is the withdrawal of the subsidy. So we haven't been discussing any sort of monetary penalties. Those, I believe, would belong more to the domestic procedures, for instance, if there's an incursion into IUU fishing activities. But in the WTO, for now, we've been discussing the removal or the withdrawal of the subsidy as part of the remedy to be achieved in the disciplines. But that's also one of those questions that we still have pending under dispute settlement. What is the appropriate remedy when a member is found to be non-compliant with the future disciplines that we're able to craft? So for now, that's what I can say on this topic. And again, hopefully we have a better answer soon from members. But thanks again for your question.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes, Brian, you have the floor again. Go ahead.
Easy question. To what extent has the technical assistance and capacity building been fully, so a country that requires technical assistance, what's the process, and has it been fully institutionalized, or is there a full administrative arrangement for technical assistance and capacity building to assist countries to guide them with these subsidies?
Yeah, it's an easy question, but a difficult answer. so I'll try to do my best. With technical assistance and capacity building, there is already a provision within the draft consolidated document referring to this technical assistance and capacity building. The details of how that process would come about after we have this agreement has not been yet discussed fully in detail. But I do believe, and again, this is my view from outside of the, let's say, not as a member, but as the chair of the negotiations, that I do believe the technical assistance and capacity building is going to be a key factor in solving some of the issues we have in front of us. Because what we've been hearing from many members is that they can't agree, or they're still entrenched in some views because they don't feel that they have the capacity at this moment to comply or to implement some of the provisions as being crafted. So if we're able to give the comfort to those members via technical assistance or capacity building, we might be able to unblock some of those key pending issues. But that's something, again, that we'll be discussing soon in the negotiations. I hope that helps to solve some of those questions, Brian.
Thank you again. Just while we wait on the ministerial in 2021, and while we wait on the cementing of the agreement, in the meantime, a country that requires some or has indicated some level of technical assistance, what should be or what could be the approach by those countries?
Well, in the process of the actual negotiations, I think it's important that members are clear when they feel they can or they cannot or would not be able to implement some of the provisions. And I think that helps a lot in defining what sort of technical assistance and maybe a little bit more of detail of what would be needed for all members to feel comfortable in complying with these provisions that the whole group is trying to craft on these disciplines. In the meantime, while we have those disciplines crafted, I think bilateral bilateral approaches to other members that would be able to provide some technical assistance would be preferable, because for the purpose of the negotiations, those types of needs are key for the NGR, for the whole negotiating group to know, so that again, we can craft those disciplines so that it actually responds to the needs of members. But in order for the other members and even the WTO to provide for that technical assistance, we need those disciplines. So in the meantime, if it's something urgent, if it's needed, it's easier or it's better if the member either approaches bilaterally some other member that would be able to provide and would be in the capacity to provide this type of technical assistance, or even to the WTO if needed.
Thank you.
Are there any other participants that would like to take the floor for any questions, raise any questions, or make any comment on this topic? We still have a couple of minutes left, so feel free to raise your virtual hand. It seems like nobody else would like to raise any other questions or comments. So I guess we're coming to the end of this session. I would like to take this opportunity to thank again the ITTC for this kind invitation, for allowing me to participate and to share some of the insights of the negotiating process on the fisheries subsidies disciplines that we're trying to craft here in the WTO. And of course, to all the attendees, all the participants, live participants, but also those that are watching the recorded version of this session for your interest. And hopefully, again, we can come to a conclusion of this fisheries subsidies negotiation soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, evening, or afternoon.